Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Hudson Institute. I'm Nate Sibley, and I work at Hudson's Kleptocracy Initiative, where we conduct policy research on countering corruption from authoritarian regimes. Today, we'll be discussing transatlantic efforts to counter the proceeds of corruption and other forms of illicit finance. The World Economic Forum has estimated that the global cost of corruption is around $2.6 trillion every year. That's 5% of global GDP. The World Bank says that more than $1 trillion are paid in bribes each year worldwide. So it's a huge deal. In a globalized economy, of course, this money often doesn't stay where it is stolen, but it is laundered through offshore tax havens into major financial centers. This flood of corrosive capital has major implications for prosperity and security, not only in the developing countries where the money is stolen, but in the advanced democracies where that money ends up as well. As the world's two biggest financial centers, the United States and the United Kingdom have a special responsibility, and I would argue a great opportunity to lead the world in finding innovative ways to crack down on dirty money. So I'm really excited and really honored to be joined by two very distinguished lawmakers from either side of the Atlantic who have not only thought a lot about these issues, but consistently shown some really strong leadership in their respective national legislatures as well. Firstly, delighted to introduce Senator Bill Cassidy, MD, who has represented Louisiana in the US Senate since 2014. He previously served his community working and teaching as a physician for 3 decades. He was elected to the Louisiana State Senate in 2006 and then the US House of Representatives in 2008. His current Senate committee assignments include, most relevantly for us, the Senate Committee on Finance, Energy and Natural Resources, Veterans Affairs, Health, Education, Labor and Pensions, and the Joint Economic Committee. So a long and distinguished record of public service, not only to Louisiana, but to the United States. I'm delighted this includes a very active interest in illicit finance issues, especially the topic of trade-based money laundering, which we can explain and discuss in more detail a bit later. Senator, forced me to actually welcome you back to Hudson because you've spoken here twice before, so very warm welcome back. We're delighted to have you this morning.
Thank you.
I'm also joined from across the pond, as we say, by John Penrose, who is the Member of Parliament for Weston-super-Mare and the Prime Minister's anti-corruption champion. He was appointed to that position by Theresa May back in 2017 and then reappointed by Boris Johnson last year. Mr. Penrose began his career in business at JP Morgan, McKinsey and publishing firms, and he was first elected to Parliament in 2005. His ministerial appointments have included a Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, a Lord Commissioner of Her Majesty's Treasury, and most recently as Minister of State to Northern Ireland. So also a very distinguished record, not only of public service, but expertise on the issue we'll be discussing today. And also a very warm welcome back to Hudson. Sadly not in person, but you gave a rousing speech on illicit finance at Hudson last year. Unfortunately, it was at an evening reception. We didn't record it. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to correct that mistake today. Gentlemen, we have somewhat limited time, of course. So as discussed, I think if it's okay, we'll just dive straight into some questions and discussion. So Senator Cassidy, if I could begin with you. The US has for decades now been the global leader on fighting illicit finance. First country to criminalize money laundering and outlaw foreign bribery, for example. So there's so much going on in the news right now, though. What are some of the threats, in your view, that make it so important for the United States and its policymakers to keep their eye on the ball when it comes to combating illicit finance?
Yeah, the United States has traditionally provided leadership in both promoting democracy and in promoting a capitalism that brings prosperity to all. Illicit financing is a hydra-headed monster. And you might see trade-based money laundering as an aspect of it. You might see laundering dollars through real estate, which drives up the cost of housing. Counterfeit goods that are not just counterfeit, but suboptimal. So think of your high-performance vehicle that breaks apart because the counterfeit good that's inserted into the supply chain is not adequate for the specifications. Drug trade, clearly related to this. Now, that threatens the United States, but it also threatens the rest of the world. So the United States is going to maintain its leadership in terms of democracy and promoting a capitalism that brings prosperity to all. This has to be addressed in all of its hydra-headed kind of manifestations.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Mr. Penrose, in a similar vein, the UK undertook a pretty ambitious and expansive anti-corruption drive, passing many laws over the past 5 or 10 years or so. We can talk about what those were shortly, but what were the factors that led the UK to begin this journey of trying to tidy up its financial system?
Some of them were the same as the ones that we just heard from the senator, in that we hold we play hosts to the second large wholesale money market on the planet. So New York and London, both equally important, and it's crucial for our economy, but it also makes us inevitably a magnet for money launderers, because they want to try and wash dirty money to make it clean so they can live off it later in their lives. So it's just part of the risk that comes with the territory of having one of these huge and tremendously valuable financial assets on your shores. You've got to make sure that you raise your game when it comes to dealing with the attempted criminality, and even if it's only a tiny fraction of 1% of the money that washes through the City of London every day, even that tiny fraction of 1% is still billions of pounds and billions of dollars, and potentially of dirty money, which just creates the most enormous reputational risks, and it creates the same kind of reputational risks for the UK as it does for the USA, because we're both proponents of an international rules-based system, so we can't have something which undermines the legitimacy of that. We are both international proponents and domestic proponents of a capitalist democratic system, which only works if you have people who are, if crime does not pay, and you genuinely can see that it is sensible and right to do the right thing, to be honest, to pay your taxes, pay your dues, all those things. And if you can see people who aren't doing that and are getting away with it and are prospering from it, it undermines the legitimacy of the entire thing. But I guess the other point, which is rather more fundamental and rather basic, is you mentioned, Nate, the cost of corruption to doing business can be the equivalent of a sort of a 10% or even a 20% tax on exporters if they're exporting to a higher corruption area compared to a lower corruption area. That just means that if you aren't a well-connected local business, you are always trying to export to that particular location with one hand tied behind your back. The playing field is tilted very, very seriously against you. That harms our economy, it harms the US's economy, it harms any open trading economy of any kind. And I guess the final point to make is that what we've also found is that you can take some of these measures, and we'll talk about what they were in detail perhaps later on. You can take some of these measures and they're really cheap. I mean, they work, and they are some of the most effective supply side things you can do to boost your economy. And the Treasury loves it because it doesn't cost taxpayers dollars.
No, you couldn't agree more. And I mean, I was going to ask you about this. You're both conservative members of the Conservative Party in your respective countries. I think traditionally the case for countering illicit financial flows, this movement of dirty money across borders, the past few decades grew out of the movement for sort of arguments about international development or tax justice in developing countries. It's been really interesting to me working in DC the past few years to see the argument not switch around. Those are still the driving, underlying, and important things. But particularly to people talking about national security, but also this pro-business, pro-capitalism case. So I wanted to, John, you talked about that quite eloquently there. Senator, do you have any thoughts on that? Why should businesses, American businesses, who are often understandably reluctant to support measures that will add, let's be honest, that occasionally they add a regulatory burden to them to some extent. Why should they be getting on board with some of these measures that we can talk about in a minute that are being proposed to crack down on illicit finance and corruption?
Was that for John or for me?
I'm sorry, for you, Senator.
Okay, yeah. First, John can speak about the relative low cost of beneficial ownership regulations relative to benefit. But let me just speak about counterfeit goods. Counterfeit goods are where you basically steal somebody's intellectual property and you kind of mark up because it looks as if it is the real thing, but it's not. I was walking along the street yesterday and I saw a Chanel coronavirus mask. And I started laughing. I said, is that the real thing? No. And so, but you can just go through cigarettes, for example. Paraguay, or I think it's Paraguay, I always get my Uruguay and my Paraguay confused, but they have a big market for counterfeit cigarettes, which are shipped around the world. So there is a real case for cigarette manufacturers to be concerned about that. Now you might argue cigarette, big tobacco, we're not going to be concerned about them, except that this is how Hezbollah finances their activities, taking counterfeit cigarettes, selling them in Europe, not paying the excise tax that should go to the government, and taking the delta between that which should be paid in excise tax and using it to finance international terrorism. So yes, there is a parochial interest, if you will, for the company who wants to protect its IP, but that also expands around into many other sectors. One more thing I will add, counterfeit goods, again, if you have a supply chain dependent upon high specification goods, a counterfeit good enters into that supply chain, which is not up to the specifications. It appears as if it is adequate. It is actually inadequate. You put it in a high performance vehicle, or you name it, then it breaks down. One more example, I just can't resist. There's also the chance to corrupt the underlying purpose of it. There was an allegation the People's Liberation Army forced a Chinese manufacturer of computer goods to insert a chip into servers that allowed the information crossing the servers to go back to the People's Liberation Army from the United States, Canada, elsewhere in the free world. That's obviously one of the concerns about the 5G network that Huawei is trying to do. So that's not technically trade-based money laundering, but if you will, it is under the penumbra of why we need to be careful about the products that are being formed or being produced, why companies have a vested interest, and why we should have that same vested interest.
I couldn't agree more. And one of the interesting, you flagged counterfeit goods, and also the shell company issue, which we can talk much more about later on, which I know John will be absolutely happy to talk about at great length. But so one of the areas I've seen that flare up, Senator, recently is the Pentagon complaining that the use of shell companies to conceal the supply of counterfeit goods from foreign suppliers, they don't name them, but i.e. China, is actually a really serious national security threat. It's the biggest threat, the top Pentagon official has said, to the US defense procurement supply chain. So this is really failure to sort of tackle these problems is really coming home to roost as far as US national security is concerned. John, just before we move on, I wonder what is the view on the national security implications of illicit finance in the UK? Obviously, the US and the UK have different national security roles. They work very closely together on almost all issues. But was there a national, we've talked about the pro-business, pro-capitalism argument. Was there a national security imperative in the UK to start shifting out this dirty money as well? I know there's the widely sort of popularized mafia problem with Russian oligarchs living in London and so on and so forth, for example.
Yes, I'm not sure that them living here is necessarily in and of itself a threat to national security. That's more to do with laundering the proceeds in some cases of dirty money instead. So that's a criminal thing rather than necessarily national security. I hear what the Senator says about the risks to, for example, 5G or to other kinds of counterfeit goods there. And I think probably one of the most recent issues, which is really reinforcing that point for us here, and I suspect in other countries too, is the coronavirus pandemic. So, there has been the most almighty international scramble to source protective equipment for healthcare workers, to keep them safe if they're treating people who have the virus, to procure testing kits, to procure ventilators, all these things. And the number of companies that had never existed, even on paper, 6 weeks, 6 months before, that have suddenly sprung into existence and are claiming to be able to provide all sorts of things, many of which, as the Senator rightly points out, it will not be fit for purpose, will not actually do the job that they're supposed to do, and as a result will put lives at risk, either because it will mean that the treatment that is being provided to patients will not work, or because it will mean that the doctors and nurses and healthcare assistants who are supposed to be working with them are not protected from the virus in the way that they need to be.
You've actually written a couple of articles about this recently. This was going to be my next question, actually, about the two sort of big geopolitical dynamics, if you will, playing out while we are looking at ways to upgrade our fight against illicit finance. One is, the rising confrontation between the United States and China, and the other is obviously the recovery from the coronavirus pandemic, which affects us all, everyone in the world, to a greater or lesser extent. You've written some articles about this, John, recently. I wonder if you just expand. What should governments be doing in terms of what is, you mentioned one of the aspects of the threat from illicit finance there. What else can governments be doing to ensure the integrity of their response to the coronavirus?
I mean, one of the things I've concluded after a little while in this job is that I've been an absolutely terrible criminal mastermind. I just don't think the right way at all. But people who do think that way, I think, reckon that the pandemic is a once in a generation opportunity. It's like several Christmases come at once. And the reason why is because, as I said, everybody is scrambling to save lives, move at speed, to establish new government agencies for healthcare treatment, to source and procure essential medical supplies of one kind or another. And then, incidentally, when the actual infections are under control, many countries are then going to have very material economic reflotation packages as well. So there's an enormous amount, an unprecedented amount of money sloshing around both the developed world but also the less developed world too. And it's being moved at speed, it's being moved in unorthodox ways, it's being moved in search of goods that aren't normally being procured in this way at all. And so the processes and the controls on how those decisions are taken and where the money goes and who the suppliers are, just aren't necessarily either in place at all, or if they are in place, they aren't supposed to be in place to work as fast as everybody needs to if they're going to save lives. And so as a result, all the normal controls of preventing corruption, of preventing fraud, of making sure that the things that you are buying in order to provide your healthcare equipment, an awful lot of those are weaker than they would normally be. And my basic point is that no matter what stage and what level of controls and protections your particular country and jurisdiction had at the start of the pandemic, those will be weaker than they normally are by now, just because everyone's having to move so fast. And that's just a huge opportunity for organized crime, just enormous. And that's why there's the IMF is actually rather good on this. The chief executive of the IMF has just said, look, spend what you have to, but keep the receipts, because it's absolutely essential that people know that there will be an audit trail after this, because if they know there's going to be an audit trail after this, then they know that they've got to do the right thing, because if they may not get caught today, if they mess up or they do something which they know is wrong, they will get caught eventually, providing we keep that right.
Yeah. Now, Senator, so you have a medical background, Senator, as well as this fascination with illicit finance issues. I wonder if you had anything to add on what is the US doing? What would you like to see the US do to ensure the integrity of its response to the coronavirus pandemic? Not so much like within the US, but in its relations with other countries. So, for example, sending increased aid to other countries to help them fight the pandemic and so on and so forth. Do you have any sort of thoughts on that?
Let me back up a little bit, because I'm going to disagree with John just a touch. I actually think that trade-based money laundering does have the potential. In fact, it is a national security issue if you recognize that it's part and parcel of how transnational criminal organizations finance drug trade. Now, the United States is losing about 60,000 people a year from drug overdoses. And so you cannot finance that drug trade without trade-based money laundering, as one example. And that is the way the Chinese move fentanyl precursors to, say, Mexico or Colombia. But as well, it's the way dollars move out of the United States to those countries. Indeed, you can look at Venezuela, which has now become a criminal state, in which transnational criminal organizations have infiltrated and now have taken over the government, if you will. China is also there. Hezbollah is also there. It is not beyond the imagination to think of a Caracas high-end coffee shop where groups, people representing all three, come together to come up with schemes as to how to either finance terrorism or to ship drugs to the United States from China in a way that undermines Western democracy. So I do think that this poses a national security threat. Indeed, the one that just flies below the radar, never quite recognized because of its complexity, but it's absolutely there. Coronavirus, I agree totally with John. This is a way that large sums of dollars are moving quickly, and it is a way to take legitimate capitalism and to put either within it or on top of it illicit trade in a way to both make money from selling goods which are suboptimal and or to move dollars back and forth so that ill-gotten gains can be transferred out to further criminal activity. And John and England, or Great Britain, has done so much good work on beneficial ownership. I also think, however, there needs to be innovative policy solutions. One thing we have promoted is a distributed ledger, better known as blockchain. Now, folks are familiar with the private blockchain in which you get Bitcoin. There's also a public blockchain in which the relevant parties can monitor trade transactions. Now, people who know about supercomputers say that it can be corrupted, but it takes a lot of, literally a lot of energy to have the computer power to corrupt a blockchain. But if you had a distributed ledger where you knew who produced the good, who transferred the good, to whom did they pass it, and then where did it end up, with the dollars that track along with the good being related to one another through the distributed ledger, you'd have far more integrity and far more ability to see a company that pops up to sell N95 mask. What is the origin of the mask? Where is the money going, and where does it end up? So I do think we have tools to combat this. We need to implement those tools.
Can you agree more? So it seems sometimes like we're looking at these in somewhat parceled ways. So we look at ways to strengthen purely the financial system, but we're not looking at the same time as ways to introduce anti-corruption measures, as you're talking about, Senator, within the trade system, when actually they're kind of the same. You know, it's all linked and it's the same sort of thing. On which note, I would like to start to talk more about solutions now, actually, because you've both been very proactive in promoting. Senator, you were just talking about solution basically to trade-based money laundering. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about the phenomenon of trade-based money laundering, because I think it tends to go under it's something that the anti-corruption community experts are talking a lot more about now. But I was shocked to read the other day that this is from Global Financial Integrity, that worldwide trade-based money laundering accounts for up to $7.7 trillion of lost, not revenue, but money that's just kind of trade gaps in accounts on either side of a country's border. So this is potentially the biggest money laundering problem of all. Is that why you became so interested in it? And I wonder if you could talk a bit more about the white paper that you authored on this last year, I think it was.
Yeah, so I really got interested in it, trying to understand how to strengthen the economies of Central American governments or Central American countries. You know, just to show you the train of thought, what can you do to help a Central American country so that its people don't feel motivated to migrate through irregular migration? Well, then you begin to understand what are the fundamental weaknesses of such companies. The fundamental weakness is that they have insufficient government revenue in order to invest in infrastructure to promote foreign direct investment. Why do they have insufficient government revenue? Well, let's imagine this. If you have goods valued at $2 million, but through corruption and trade-based money laundering, you ship them to the country, the invoice goes through a third country. When the invoice goes through, it's marked down. So instead of $2 million being reported at the port of entry, because of corruption in the invoice, it's only at 500,000.
Mm-hmm.
The country of receipt loses the tariff. They're only putting a tariff on 500,000 instead of 2 million.
Yep.
Those who bring in the goods sell them at below market prices. And so then the sales tax or the value added tax is also lost. It's a double whammy to the fisc. Now related to this is that these transnational criminal organizations are funneling drugs through these Central American countries, and they get their dollars back through trade-based money laundering. So it is that Hydra head. It is the Hydra head of financing drug trade, of corrupting governments, of robbing them of their needed revenue for infrastructure development to attract FDI, which in turn leads to irregular migration. If you can go after the body of the Hydra, you can kill the heads.
Yep.
And that's what we have to do. And one of the ways to do that is to go after trade-based money laundering.
No, it's great, and you've shown great leadership on that, Senator, for which we're all very grateful in the anti-corruption community. John, so I should say as well, it's part of a bigger package in the US at the moment. You know, things like the Illicit Cash Act, for example, it's Senator Warner and Senator Cotton are pushing forward, and which would help upgrade the US anti-money laundering system more broadly as well. So very much, I see that, Senator, very much as part of that general push to bring the US anti-money laundering, anti-corruption system, you know, into the 21st century where it deserves to be. John, I wonder if you could talk a bit about some of the innovative reforms that the UK has introduced recently. We've mentioned in passing something called beneficial ownership, for example. You've also been looking at how to improve public-private partnerships through the JM Lit, which I'll let you explain what that is. And so on and so forth. So I wonder if you could just run us through what the UK has been doing, what you think maybe that our American cousins should maybe take up as well.
Well, the US is, as I understand, already looking at a couple of very, very potentially powerful measures in this area. But this point about beneficial ownership transparency is kind of the other side of the coin from the distributed ledger, the blockchain, which the Senator was just talking about, because if you are able to track using blockchain, you know, where the money's going and which pockets it's going through and which countries it's going through, the way that he described, you then need to know, right, well, if it comes to rest in a company in Britain, in a company in the US, or anywhere else, you need to know who's actually behind that company, who's going to be the person who's benefiting from that cash. And if it is dirty money, if it's ill-gotten gains, that presumably is the person who ultimately is the Mr. or Mrs. Big behind the international criminal enterprise. So it's really important that you know who's behind the shell companies. They cannot be anonymous. And so one of the very simple things, and this is one of the things which is just you know, wonderfully cheap and wonderfully effective, which we've started to do. It takes a little while to build the data, but it doesn't cost very much at all. Is just to say, look, if you are the beneficial owner of a firm, that means you own a controlling interest in the shares, basically, then you have to come clean about who you are and where you are. And you can't say that the owner of this company is another company, and behind that company there's another company, and behind that company there's another company. You can't have this sort of nested Russian doll kind of arrangement where shell upon shell upon shell upon shell. Successive layers means that you never actually find someone with a pulse. And so the crucial thing is, if you can get to somebody who is genuinely a living, breathing human being, then you know who they are. And at that point, if it turns out that dirty money is coming into that company, then I know who to go and arrest as well. And it just makes the job of law enforcement a great deal easier, because, you know, never forget, Al Capone didn't go to jail because he was a gangster. He went to jail because of tax fraud, you know, because the authorities were able to follow the money. And what this does is it allows you to follow the money to whoever is actually benefiting from it in the end. So beneficial ownership transparency is absolutely it's key, but also it's really cheap because it's just a little bit of disclosure. You can run a fairly, our company's house and our land registry, both of those are now heading in that direction. And when you've populated the data, it just means that you can shine a spotlight into some fairly murky corners of who owns what. And you suddenly start discovering, oh, hang on a second, how can it be that the daughter of the president of this or that kleptocratic state somewhere else in the world owns a multi-million pound penthouse in the centre of London when her notional salary is tiny? How can that be true? And you can start to follow the money more effectively. So it works, but it works best if you get the network effects of getting other countries to do it too, because there's not much point in following the money to London if they can then move it out from London to somewhere else which doesn't have beneficial ownership transparency. So it's much, much better to have the network effects of having lots of these things scattered around the world, because then it just means that the places where the ill-gotten gains can be hidden are much, much less. And the point I keep on making to other countries that are looking at this, some of them say to me, look, what happens if we have dirty money in our country and we start doing this? What happens if the dirty money leaves? I mean, it could crash our economy, particularly if you're a small country. I mean, this isn't a problem which the US would face. But if you're a small economy, what happens if we get this sudden sort of dirty money capital flight going on? To which the simple answer is, you know what? There's an awful lot more clean money than there is dirty. And what you see time and again is that if the dirty money leaves, the clean money comes. And it comes in much greater multiples, and because all of a sudden, the reputation of this being a safe place to do business is enormously positive for legitimate businesses, both domestically in whichever country it is, but also for international businesses that want to set up as well.
Senator.
Yeah, two things. Let me just first pick up on the last point John made. Dirty money is not good for a country. It's not just the corruption, which is like, to elaborate on John's point, not just the corruption, but it also inflates the value of the domestic currency, which makes it less competitive into export markets. You can look at Guatemala, where lots of money goes into that's dirty. It inflates the cost of their dollar, of their real, I think it is, or whatever their currency is, which in turn makes their exports less capable, which therefore makes their people less likely to get the benefit of foreign direct investment, because if you produce there, you're overpriced. Second, let me connect that which John said with what I said and link it with distributed ledger. You got to follow the money, but you got to follow the trade. In the US, at least, right now, there is a manifest and an invoice, and the twain never meet. So the example I gave, goods go from the United States to Guatemala, for example, to continue with Guatemala. The invoice goes through Panama and is marked down. There is no way to relate those two things. So for us to really go after this, we have to connect the invoice and the manifest. And then you see, as they track along, a discrepancy between the two, that which might be, and by the way, this also helps with legitimate companies, just to say that, because you can have a multinational with subsidiaries in two different countries taking their loss in the high tax regime and their gain in the low tax regime, and therefore pricing to take advantage of that. So there's other benefits, all of which, I like the way John put it, increase revenue to the country, to the government, whoever government it is, without increasing taxes. It is the appropriate tax level achieved by reconciling the dollar and the trade and following both simultaneously.
John?
Nick, can I just build on that point as well? Because the other benefit of this stuff is that if you have these kinds of pretty automatic and really transparently simple kinds of measures in place, what you also find is it can become very deregulatory, because I don't know how the US does this, but in the UK we have all sorts of hideously bureaucratic legacy systems for trying to stop bureaucracy. People, if you want to set up a bank account, you've got to produce endless utility bills, which sit in copies of them, paper copies sit in warehouses all around the country, and all sorts of compliance costs, which can be extensively reduced if you go to one of these simple systems, which kind of does it automatically, and it reduces that red tape cost very considerably and just makes the whole economy work more productively, makes it work faster, and it just means that everybody can get on with worrying about customers rather than having to worry about regulators, and that's just generally a better place to be.
Senator, you had some thoughts?
And again, to build upon what John just said, but to elaborate on what was earlier said by us both, if you think of the illicit economy as a sponge that soaks up moisture, if you will, from the rest of the economy, and if you think similarly of the regulatory state as that similar sponge, non-productive activity, having the open transparency and the kind of lickety-split sort of transaction that occurs if you have these systems, it wrings that sponge out, allowing the capital to flow down into the legitimate economy to fertilize, to water, you pick your metaphor, so that the illicit economy can grow with the benefits for the average person as opposed to the benefits for the kleptocrat or the drug lord or for the person who wishes to launder their dollar for any reason that flows to a relatively few people.
And just to pick up on that point and the point you were making, John, about how sometimes simple low-cost solutions can actually sweep away a whole load of regulatory nonsense that businesses are having to deal with at the moment. I work a lot on the shell company issue, and at the moment there is no beneficial ownership corporate register in the United States, but there are various things that the Treasury has tried to do in lieu of that. So banks have to grill small business owners when they come in and want to open a bank account. Who's the beneficial owner of your company? And that's up to the banks then to do that. And then the small business owner doesn't know what's going on and they can't open their account, and it takes days for that to go through. Similarly, the Treasury is demanding beneficial ownership information about certain real estate transactions from certain people involved in the real estate chain. All of these piecemeal programs could be sort of swept away by just one simple corporate beneficial ownership register, which businesses make their declaration to once. It takes them about a minute for most businesses, probably less than, and then we don't have to deal with all of this.
Yes, absolutely, to all of that, Nathan. I'm completely with you. There's also a further benefit to, which isn't to the businesses that are complying or to the regulators, which is if you are a professional services firm, for example, or a manufacturer who's looking to source materials from a previously unused, unknown supplier, and you want to do your due diligence on that supplier, and you want to know, are they going to be producing goods that are going to be kosher? Are they going to be fit for purpose? It just makes the speed quicker and the cost of doing that due diligence lower. If you've got some central register which you can just check things on and say, all right, who owns this? Oh, okay, I know where they come from, who they are. I may not have encountered them in this guise before, but I do at least know that they are a reputable firm and that I can trust what they're going to produce. Or alternatively, hang on a second, if I run a cursory search against that beneficial owner's name, I see they've been implicated in all sorts of dangerous things, and I don't want to go anywhere near them. It just makes it much more certain, much faster, and much cheaper to do your due diligence either on suppliers or on customers or on professional services clients, and takes an awful lot of cost out of that part of it as well.
Senator, do you sort of agree with the UK approach of introducing this register to deal with the shell company problem, or do you think the US has a different setup and it can solve the problem in a different way, or how would you crack down on? Because shell companies are a huge problem in the US. It produces more, apparently, than I was shocked to learn, than any other country in the world, including all the sort of traditional tax havens you think of, like the Cayman Islands and so on and so forth. Do you see this as a problem, or do you think it's something that law enforcement can already get around? What kind of solution would you like to see?
No, everything John has said I agree with, but it should be a solution so where if it's the elderly woman who really just wants to kind of roll something over, that she should not be entangled with, as you put it, grilling. On the other hand, again, when John speaks of the nested Russian doll of a shell within a shell within a shell, clearly that's not good for transparency.
Mm-hmm.
So I think beneficial ownership is essential if we're going to root this out. And it, as you described, it is obviously a problem in the United States as well.
Yeah. I mean, we're sort of getting on for time now. We talked a lot about some of the solutions on either side. Actually, just quickly, John, do you want to mention some of the other? We started talking about shell companies, and we both got carried away. So I wonder if just there are a couple of other things that the UK has done which you might want to highlight, which I know are being considered in the US as well.
So you better tell me which ones you particularly want
so,
me
for
to
example, the Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force, the public-private partnerships, and also the anti-money laundering system. So it's not just in the US. When we talk about anti-money laundering, we're just talking about banks, basically. That's not quite the case in the UK, is it?
No, exactly. So I mean, one thing where we are following the US's lead is on Magnitsky sanctions-related legislation, where the US has been a sort of real beacon, and we're sort of puffing along in the US's wake. But that's something where we're trying to catch up, because we really are impressed by both the moral and the practical effect of that. No, but what we find is that it isn't just about banks. You're absolutely right, Nate. It's about professional enablers, so that's lawyers, accountants, sometimes real estate agents too. You know, often they are, not all of them by any manner of means, but there will be a small proportion of them that are involved in enabling these kinds of dodgy transactions. So if you want to buy a multi-million-pound apartment in central London or in Manhattan or Miami or wherever it might be, you're going to need a lawyer, you're going to need an accountant, you're going to need a real estate agent, and quite a lot of the time they can be really helpful ways of flagging up when something's wrong, and that's why you need the partnership between the investigative agencies and the law enforcement agencies with the private sector, because they can be your eyes and ears, and in an enormous number of occasions, they will know when they see something which doesn't smell quite right to them, and so ours isn't working nearly as well as you could envisage that it could in future, but you need to have some kind of a flagging up system that says, hang on a second, this person's just turned up and they've done the equivalent of produced a large suitcase full of cash, and they want to buy a house with it. This is making my spider sense tingle. It's not right. You need to be able to have that kind of network of information and intelligence, and that requires a partnership. So it's absolutely essential that not only is there a benefit to the majority of legitimate professional firms in order to do this, because then they aren't facing competition from the small minority of illegitimate, criminally or tolerant firms, but also it means that it just makes your intelligence gathering a great deal more effective.
Right. So we're sort of coming towards the end of our time here, I think. So I'm just going to ask, as I was saying, we've talked a lot about some of the solutions and ideas on either side of the pond. I'd like to ask you both some final thoughts on how the UK and the US, and indeed the EU, who are sort of the missing partner at the table of this discussion, for which I apologise to them. We're really looking at the two biggest financial centres here, of course. Senator, perhaps you could start. What would you like to see happen next to strengthen cooperation between our two countries in the fight against illicit finance? Presumably you would like a distributed ledger to be adopted on both sides as a starting point.
Well, the New York and London are the transaction centers of the Western world. And so if we establish leadership and if we use our wealth to create systems that others can participate in, then all benefit. So, for example, FATF, John will know the acronym, but there is. Go ahead.
Financial Action Task Force, the global anti-money laundering watchdog.
Yeah. Right. So now when you read about it, you read that they go to Argentina, and Argentina's kind of given a clean bill, but you're also told that they kind of check boxes without really doing the forensic sort of financials that are required to see if they've really made that progress. Mm-hmm. So I do think that we could work together to strengthen FATF. Yep. You mentioned, of course, I've gone on at length regarding distributed ledger, but it's part of the problem is that if you're in a small country and you have somebody all trained up on your particular system, and then they're hired away, or they die, or they just retire, you've lost that expertise. So I also think cloud-based systems, which really don't require a lot of training, but rather just sort of an automated, it comes through and it goes, as John said, it rids the bureaucracy, but it also removes the element of having to train somebody. If nothing else, they can't be shot in a street, and thereby their death enables illicit activity to occur. So it's also a safety factor. We too can set up those systems that can, again, benefit all. And lastly, the US and other countries participate in trade transparency units. And the degree to which we work to strengthen trade transparency units around the world, not just bilaterally, but multilaterally, then that also benefits everyone around the world.
I think it was a great point. This isn't a fight that any country can hope to win on its own, because it's transnational. It's illicit financial flows across borders. By definition, there is no, only America first or UK first answer to this. It really is something where people are going to have to share a lot more information. And so, John, final thoughts from you. What would you like to see happening to strengthen the bonds between the US and the UK on this issue?
Well, I guess I start where you just with the comment you just made, Nate, which is this works. Both the distributed ledger that the Senator's talking about, but also the beneficial ownership transparency that I've been talking about, it works best as more countries become part of an international norm or standard. If we can get more countries to do that, then there are fewer hiding places for dirty money. There are fewer places that you can siphon money off to. And so international standards and standardization and norms just become more and more important, because I think if the US and the UK both do these things, it creates a huge sort of center of gravity for an enormous amount of international trade. It becomes progressively harder and harder and harder for any country to come up with a legitimate reason why they don't want to be part of it. Right. And so therefore, you get the snowball effect, you get the network effect, it becomes much, much more powerful. And it isn't just powerful from an economic and a trade and a commercial point of view. It's also, coming back to the point that both I and the Senator were making right at the start, it's also important from a democratic and capitalism point of view, because the UK's register, sorry, that's the division bell going off here, please ignore it. I don't have to go and vote, or if I do, I've got a couple of minutes. If you have a register which, in the UK's case, is visible to anybody in the world, and that means that if you have somebody who is in a foreign country that's pretty sure that there's a kleptocratic elite that's robbing the middle class blind in that country, they can follow the money. It isn't just the police. It isn't just the tax authorities. The public square can follow the money. Ordinary citizens can follow the money, and they can then start political movements to drive out corruption in their country too. It doesn't have to happen in every single country, but it's an incredibly powerful democratic force where it starts to catch light. And you've only got to look at the number of countries where changes of government have happened because people are, because the middle class in particular has risen up and said, we aren't going to take this anymore. We are unhappy with being robbed blind, and we will vote for somebody who promises us clean government. It's an incredibly powerful, incredibly internationally popular message, and it really strikes home, and it helps rules-based democratic capitalism spread right around the world. And I think that's something which the US and the UK have a very strong shared interest in, if nothing else.
No, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And I think, and I'm sure the Senator feels the same. It's not just a law enforcement issue anymore. It's become about the way that we promote democracy and capitalism around the world. This has to be part of it. And when we look at who is abusing the system from the other side, it's often our people who are intent on being adversarial towards the US and the UK as well. So there is this has really risen in the past few years to the heights of a strategic interest on both sides of the Atlantic, I think. We have come to the end of our time now. So I want to thank you both very much for your time. You're both very busy at the moment, despite the shutdown, more busy than ever probably. So we're really grateful for your thoughts, for your leadership, and for your continued interest in this really important issue. And we hope to welcome you back to Hudson Institute, hopefully in person sooner rather than later. So thank you very much.
Thank you.